Somewhere along the way, leadership became confused with self-sacrifice. The long hours, the emotional labor, the quiet carrying of everyone else's needs, and the belief underneath it all. Good leadership means giving more than you have. But here's the truth. Self-sacrifice doesn't make you a better leader. It makes you a disappearing one. A disappearing leader isn't absent. They're overpresent in the work and underpresent in the ways that matter. They give so much of themselves that the team slowly lose access to the leader they trust. This myth doesn't ask you to step back from leadership. It asks you to step back from over-responsibility. Welcome back to the Leadership Longevity Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Hughes, and today we're exploring a myth that sits deep in the identity of so many leaders, the myth of self-sacrifice. This is a myth that tells you that your needs come last, your job is to absorb the pressure, your value is measured in what you give up, and leadership is a form of martyrdom. This myth doesn't come from weakness, it comes from care, from loyalty, from wanting to do the right thing by your people. But it has a cost, one that leaders rarely see until they're already paying for it. Inside the leadership longevity ecosystem, this myth sits within survival driver 1, the health depletion pattern. This survival driver fractures your internal layer, your adaptive conditions, the part of the ecosystem that holds your biology, physiology, energy, your cognitive load, your emotional bandwidth, and your recovery cycles. At the center of the internal layer sits your high-value operating system. Endurance, recovery, adaptation, and rhythm are the 4 events that determine how your internal system stabilizes under load. Self-sacrifice teaches you that your worth is tied to overgiving, that your value is measured by depletion, and that protecting others requires abandoning yourself. But in regenerative leadership, your limits are not a liability. They are leadership infrastructure. Across this season, you'll hear me reference the ecosystem, the living system that holds your internal and external conditions. You don't need the full map yet, although it's coming soon. For now, just know this. Self-sacrifice fractures the system at its foundation, not through force, not through delay, but through over-responsibility. The myth of self-sacrifice says, if someone has to pay the cost, it should be me. It tells you that your worth is tied to your willingness to overgive, and that leadership is about absorbing more than you carry. That protecting others requires abandoning yourself. Organizations reinforce this myth too, through the quiet cultural message. You're paid the big bucks, so your health should pay too. But no amount of compensation can override physiology. No salary can buy back clarity, presence, or emotional steadiness. And no role is worth the erosion of the human being inside it. Self-sacrifice feels noble, but it quietly erodes the very capacity you need to lead. So you take on extra work. You stay late so your team can go home. You buffer the pressure from above. You hold the emotional load that no one else seems to see. And sometimes without realizing you step in to protect people from their own mistakes. You rewrite the email. You fix the deck. You smooth the conflict. You carry the consequences and you tell yourself, it's fine. I can handle it. That's what leadership is. But slowly, your patience thins, your clarity fogs, your boundaries blur, your energy drains, and the people you were trying to protect start to feel the consequences of your depletion. And the consequences of never getting to learn, stretch, or be accountable. Rescuing always feels like care until you see what it quietly takes away. And for many leaders right now, there's another layer, The one we don't talk about enough: financial pressure. A rising cost of living, shrinking margins, tighter budgets, teams under strain, and boards demanding more with less. When money feels tight, personally or organisationally, self-sacrifice can feel like the only responsible choice. You tell yourself, I'll absorb it, I'll stretch a little further, I'll carry more so the team doesn't have to. Not because you're careless, but because you're trying to protect people in a system that feels financially fragile. But financial pressure doesn't change biology. It doesn't change the cost. It doesn't change what over-responsibility does to your internal system. And it doesn't change the truth that self-sacrifice still fractures the system, even when the pressure absolutely feels justified. This myth is seductive because it feels heroic. People admire your dedication, they praise your commitment, they rely on your reliability. They trust your capacity to carry more, and sometimes stepping in is the right call. And that's what makes this myth so tricky. Rescuing doesn't start as overreach. It starts as competence, it starts as care, it starts as responsible leadership, but over time, the line between wise intervention and unnecessary absorption becomes almost invisible. Self-sacrifice is not generosity, it's overextension. And overextension always spills into the system. I once worked with another leader, let's call them Morgan, who embodies this myth beautifully. Morgan was the kind of leader everyone trusted. Steady, capable, deeply committed to their team. Whenever something went wrong, Morgan stepped in. Whenever someone struggled, Morgan carried the load. Whenever pressure rose, Morgan absorbed it. And whenever a team member made a misstep, Morgan quietly fixed it before anyone noticed. Not just to protect the individual, but to protect the broader system they were part of. And here's the part Morgan rarely admitted, even to themselves. They didn't only step in when something had gone wrong, they stepped in when they imagined it could go wrong. Not out of anxiety, but out of experience. Morgan had lived through the fallout of decisions made too quickly. They had seen how small mistakes can snowball. They understood the risks others simply couldn't see in Morgan's mind. Stepping in wasn't overreach, it was prudence. It was responsibility, it was foresight. And sometimes Morgan was 110% right. But over time, the line between wise stewardship and anticipatory rescuing became harder to see. One day, Morgan arrived exhausted. I don't understand. I'm doing everything I can to protect my team, but they seem to be pulling away from me. So I asked, what are you protecting them from? Morgan paused, then said quietly, from consequences, from discomfort, from themselves. And honestly, the fallout the organisation can't afford right now. Later that week, a team member made a decision with real consequences. Morgan stepped in again to shield them. But this time, the team didn't feel protected. They felt sidelined, diminished, shut out of their own growth. Because Morgan wasn't just absorbing the pressure, they were absorbing the learning. They weren't just preventing harm, they were preventing development. Morgan wasn't failing, Morgan was disappearing. And in disappearing, they were unintentionally keeping their team small. Self-sacrifice doesn't create safety. It creates distance. And rescuing doesn't create strong teams. It creates dependent ones. So what Morgan was experiencing isn't personal failure. It's what's happening in every leader's body and every team's psychology when self-sacrifice becomes the operating system. So chronic overgiving increases the allostatic load, the physical wear and tear that builds when you carry more than your system can sustainably hold. Your nervous system loses its edges, your clarity narrows, and your tolerance thins. This isn't mindset, it's biology. Your internal state too, of course, is contagious. But in this myth, it's not depletion that spreads, it's overfunctioning. So when you step in too often, your team unconsciously steps back. Also, under chronic pressure, your brain begins to anticipate risk. You don't just respond to problems. You pre-respond to imagined ones. It feels like foresight, it feels like responsibility, but it quietly drives overfunctioning. And then when we think about learning theory and removing the consequences and how that removes growth, it's quite interesting because people grow through friction. When you remove the consequences, you remove the learning loop. Confidence softens, accountability thins, dependency forms, and the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. The more you step in, the less they stretch. The less they stretch, the more you feel you need to step in. Not because they're incapable, but because the system has reorganized around your overfunctioning. Not all intervention is overreach. Not all stepping in is rescuing. There are moments when your judgment, experience, and foresight are exactly what the situation requires. But when stepping in becomes a pattern, particularly a preemptive one, it stops being stewardship and starts becoming self-sacrifice. Inside the ecosystem, self-sacrifice fractures the high-value operating system, specifically the sequence of recovery, adaptation, and rhythm. Endurance breaks this sequence through override, deferral breaks it through delay, and health as a perk breaks it through minimization. Self-sacrifice breaks it through over-responsibility. 4 distortions, 1 foundational fracture. And when the foundation fractures, leaders just don't lose capacity, they lose perspective. The system becomes heavier, the work becomes noisier, and the leader becomes the buffer instead of the guide. Boundaries are not barriers. They are leadership infrastructure. Your limits are not a weakness. They are a form of stewardship. Generosity without boundaries is depletion. Generosity with boundaries is leadership. Self-sacrifice asks you to trade your health for other people's comfort. Regenerative leadership asks you to honor your limits so that others can grow inside theirs. This is the shift from rescuing to resourcing, from overfunctioning to shared responsibility, from martyrdom to maturity. And I want to name something clearly here because it really matters. Financial pressure does not make self-sacrifice sustainable. It makes it seductive. When budgets tighten and teams shrink, when the cost of living rises and when organizations feel financially stretched, it can feel like the only responsible choice is to, in fact, carry more yourself. But here's the truth. Financial strain doesn't change your biology. It doesn't change your internal rhythm, and it doesn't change the cost of over responsibility. And it doesn't change what your team needs from you. Because in financially constrained environments, your steadiness becomes even more essential. Your clarity becomes even more valuable, and your boundaries become even more protective. Your internal rhythm becomes the system's stabilizer. Self-sacrifice doesn't solve financial pressure. It amplifies it. Because depleted leaders make reactive decisions. Foggy leaders miss signals, and overextended leaders carry work that should be distributed. And exhausted leaders unintentionally create anxious systems. Capacity is the antidote to financial pressure, not self-sacrifice. Boundaries protect clarity, clarity protects decisions, decisions protect resources, and resources protect the system. That's why your limits are not a luxury in hard times. They are leadership infrastructure. So this week, When you feel the urge to step in, pause for one breath and ask yourself, is this a moment that truly requires my intervention or a moment that requires their growth? If it's truly high risk, step in with intention. If it's not, step back with trust. One breath, one moment of discernment. That's how the pattern begins to shift. And that's your tiny experiment for this week. Your reflective question could be, where am I giving more than I have? And where am I giving what was never mine to carry? What learning, growth, or consequence am I unintentionally taking away from others? Let it be honest, let it be human. This question reveals the exact moment where care becomes overreach and responsibility becomes rescue. For your ecosystem practice then, once a week, choose a situation where you've been tempted to step in and run it through this filter. Is the risk real or imagined? Is the consequence irreversible or recoverable? Is this a moment for your expertise or their development? Is stepping in stewardship or self-sacrifice? This isn't about abandoning responsibility. It's about leading with clarity, not compulsion. It's about shifting from reflex to discernment, from carrying everything to carrying what is yours, from protecting people to preparing them. This is how you build teams that are capable, accountable, and resilient, not over-dependent on your over-functioning. Self-sacrifice is not leadership. Sustainable generosity is. Releasing the myth of self-sacrifice feels like stepping out of depletion and back into dignity. It's the moment you realize that giving more doesn't make you a better leader. Giving from wholeness does. It feels like your boundaries strengthening, your generosity deepening, and your leadership becoming more humane. Because it's no longer extracted from your health. It feels like returning to yourself, steady, present, intact, so you can be the leader your team can actually feel. It's nourishing, sovereign, and aligned. The kind of leadership where you stay visible without disappearing inside the work. As we close this first survival driver, the health depletion pattern, everything we've explored has been about your capacity, your physiology, your boundaries, your humanity. Because without capacity, influence collapses. Before we move into the next survival driver, we're going to widen the frame. In our next episode, I'm going to walk you through the leadership longevity ecosystem, the architecture that holds your internal and external conditions. It's the map beneath the myths, the system that explains why these patterns show up, how they interact, and what stabilizes them. If survival driver 1 showed you what fractures your foundation, the ecosystem will show you what strengthens it. I'll meet you there.